Welcome to the show, Dale. How are you?
Good.
Awesome. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. You've got quite the fan base now on LinkedIn. I'm a bit jealous.
Yeah, and I only started posting 5 months ago, so I never posted once before the very end of August.
And you sort of just hit out of the gates, and I think a lot of the content is resonating. So I thought, okay, we've been talking on and off for a bit, but I was like, okay, I got to go have Dale on the show. I do a lot of work in complex product categories, so generally it's high value or high risk or very complex transactions, B2B mostly, a bit of B2C. But over to you, it seems like you're very much similar to that, but in a specific niche. Can you just tell us exactly what you do?
In the last few years, primarily in biotech and clinical diagnostics, so working with typically early stage VC backed startups. They've gone through the product development phase and they're ready to start commercialization. So I will typically come in ahead of product launch and start to take them through all of the commercialization components, including figuring out how to do your initial marketing, how to present the product, how to launch the product, but also usually involved in standing up the sales team, and also with things like working with distributors, working with partners. So everything involved in the commercialization side.
Great. And obviously that's product, that's distribution, pricing, promotion, and everything else in between, right?
Right. All the language.
All the
And
hard
even
work.
including figuring out who to sell it to, which is not always as obvious as people think it is.
Yeah, well, actually, on that note, I mean, it sounds like, yeah, I mean, I deal with that as well, but all anybody wants to talk about on social media is like, hey, here's our 60-second television commercial. I'm like, there's just so much more to it. That's a very, very small piece, maybe the end piece or the cap on the iceberg, but underneath is like these all these other very interesting things. So, and I think it's a good topic to talk about the distribution as well of like who are we selling to and how does that purchase decision get made. And some of these categories, it's a very complex decision making process that involves lots of different people, all with their different agendas. And that's one thing that I think you were talking about recently, which is this decision making committee. We see a lot of this in B2B SaaS as well, or software, where the environment's now changed. There's a bit more financial discretion on some of these procurement purchases. And that sometimes goes over the radar of the vendor's marketing team, maybe not appreciating exactly how that happens. So can you enlighten us?
I've done a number of things other than work in biotech. So I only jumped into biotech mid-career, and I've actually have been pulled back into other industries even in the intervening years since then. So I had a company for quite a number of years that primarily did technology development projects, but some of that was a lot of data work. And we were primarily focused on the Fortune 100. And one of the things that ended up getting pulled into was consulting work with global procurement groups. That led me to be able to sit in on a lot of these buying committees as an insider behind the closed doors and watch what was going on. And at the same time, for years, I was selling into these companies. So I was on the other side of the table as well, because I was selling projects into these companies. When I made that jump from selling into the companies to being behind the closed doors in these buying committees, it was very much a revelation. I think almost everything that marketers believe happens in those buying committees have nothing to do with what really happens. And you really see this reflected in the way they do the marketing. And you'll hear very absurd stuff people say. For instance, we've got to reach the CFO, and we've got to reach the CISO or the CIO or whatever, because we need to be able to influence them. These people don't do this. They have people 14 layers below them on the org chart that's in there. They don't even know these things exist. And the question I always ask people is, do you really think the CFO at Google sits in on the buying committee for choosing the toilet paper for the employee bathrooms? Probably not. Now, this is all done by much, much lower level people in the company than people imagine. And even in much smaller companies, you look at companies that are 50, 100 million that will have structured procurement processes, and you do not have the CFO or the CEO sitting on these things. You have people layers below them. And the problem is that you don't know these committees exist and you don't know who sits on them. So there's really no effective way to target them. You just don't know who in the organization. And the organizations tend to be very careful about this. In fact, if they catch you leaking this information, HR will come and have a very unhappy conversation with you because they don't want this kind of information being leaked out of the company. And I've been able to, at times, reverse engineer some of this just by looking at what people say on LinkedIn. And I remember a case, this was with a major oil company. And it wasn't really a buying committee. It was a project management group on a like a $15 billion project. And I had figured out who the key people were on this project management committee. And I made some comment about it, and I got some very shocked private conversations. I wasn't even a customer. It was totally outsider, wanting to know who had leaked this and how did I know this? And it was like I put it together piece by piece just from comments that people made and knowing that there had to be this sort of a committee associated with this project. But those are very rare cases. In general, you're not going to go to Sixth Sense and have them tell you who's sitting on the buying committee because they don't know either.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because some of these ABM programs, account-based management marketing programs, they'll try to figure out who the key decision makers are, put them in an audience, and they'll, hey, just target, these people within the organization, you'll be done. And I'm like, number one, senior executives don't have time to be like fighting around on LinkedIn and Facebook and stuff all the time. So like, how do you know that audience is even matched in the first place? And then secondarily, like it's generally their EA or PA that's like controlling their LinkedIn account anyway. So like, you're not even talking to the executive, even if it is them online. So, there's another filter in between that. Yeah. Coming back to the buying committees, though, what's been happening just for context in SaaS is that a lot of these B2B SaaS companies are having trouble selling, whereas they didn't have it before. And I think what they go is, there must be some product market fit problem with our product offering. Make sure there's better fit here between that. And it's very sort of functional based product thinking, not the political consideration layer. And then maybe even above politics is like that procurement sort of layer as well, where there's this fallacy I find in maybe more naive marketers that the best product wins, the functionally best quality at the lowest price kind of wins. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of not true.
If the best product wins, Salesforce would not have sold anything last year.
It's a clunky product.
I mean, really. Has anybody looked at that? Has anybody looked at that or used it recently? I mean, this is not a fun product to work in. And there are some really excellent CRM packages out there, but no one knows about because they can't get their act together on the marketing.
Why is Salesforce so popular then?
Sorry, because it has 35% market share. And what I'm about to say is for the CRM category, but it applies to every category out there. If you look at the CRM category, 75% of market share is controlled by 5 companies. These are all companies you've heard from before. It's Salesforce, it's Oracle, it's IBM, it's Adobe, forget who the 5th one is.
HubSpot.
But these are major players. And the deal is that market share ranking has not changed in a decade. And there has not been a significant shift in the relative market share in a decade. And 35% of the total is Salesforce. The other half of that top 75% are 4 more companies. There are 1,900 CRM packages on the market. So if you look at all of the companies that are going to buy a new CRM package this year, there's a 75% chance it will be one of these 5 big name companies because the market share doesn't change. And they're not buying it because it's the best product. When was the last time anything from Microsoft was the best in whatever category? You buy Microsoft because you won't get fired. And that's the core issue. And so it's not about value. And it's not about the best product, and it's not about features, pricing, value. That stuff goes way, way to the bottom of the list of things that are driving buying considerations. The number one driver, and there's really good MMM data that's out there looking at this. The number one driver of buying decisions is market share.
Double jeopardy, hey? Just like, that's it.
Exactly, yeah. That's all based on empirical data that they've done looking at this. Others have looked at this in other ways, but the number one factor for choosing a vendor is market size. By the time you get down to things like price and value, it's way down the list. There are also significant trust factors that people look at. Now, market size itself is a trust factor.
Yep.
Because what they're looking at isn't the best product; it's the product that's least likely to get them fired,
or a company big enough that they can sue.
Again, you see this
if something bad happens, right?
It doesn't matter because the deal is you're the decision maker inside the company. It may be a shared decision, but your name is still on this thing. And if this thing blows up, even to no fault of your own, you're going to be tagged as being responsible for a failed buying decision. And that's basically going to be the end of your career if you're in a large company. And so, so what happens is that the value accrues to the company, but the risk accrues to the decision maker. And this is a really critical thing to think about, that it's not the company taking the risk, because the company's big enough that you can buy something and it doesn't work and they'll just keep rolling. The people who get crushed are the people that are making that buying decision. And what you see, there's really good Gartner data quite recently looking at enterprise B2B purchase decisions. And what they see is that 50 or 60% of purchase processes end in a no decision. And marketers need to think about what that means. What that means is the status quo product, no matter how crappy and how old, is literally perceived as being the best choice compared to every single available option on the market.
That's funny. There's a financial tweet the other day. It was like an insider account, like Insider CFO, and it's like, you'd be amazed how some of the biggest brands in like financial investment community worldwide, like multi-billion, almost $1 trillion companies, is like, they're still built on like localized Excel spreadsheets. Like, you'd be surprised how many are still like that. Like, they're not there on the integrated data warehousing, with instant dashboards, real-time dashboards. Like, no, it's still operated by an Excel spreadsheet. So that's my joke, is that, everything's still run by a local Excel file.
This is a bit of an old story, but my strong suspicion is that something like this still exists. So back in the 90s, I did a lot of work for, I had this technology development company, did a lot of work for large companies. One of the clients was well, probably shouldn't say it out loud, a major oil company. And at the time, they had 14 different SAP installations spread across the company. And they were all version locked, meaning that they had made code changes to the installation so that they could not do version upgrades. And they had different data sets, different data structures. It was a mess. But the problem was, each individual major business unit could get along fine by itself. The problem was the CFO's office, because they had to do public reporting of financials. And so the very last project I ever did for them was to write a piece of code that would go into every one of these SAP databases, going into the raw Oracle databases, extracting the data, restructuring it, renormalizing it, and dumping it all into an Excel spreadsheet that was the consolidated financials that were used for SEC reporting.
I knew it. Oh, this is too funny. Okay, so like, what are we going to say then? Well, like, as a challenger brand, then, like, this is interesting, but we kind of know this to be true. This, like, if you're a small brand, you're pretty much screwed. But like, if you are a small challenger brand, you want to get bigger. Like, is there a way we can fake being bigger or play to these buying committees, or sort of, what do we do?
I think there are good examples. I think there's some good models that people don't think about deeply enough that exist. And I think the absolute best model is the history of Salesforce. So I remember when Salesforce was released, I looked at it to buy it at one point in like 1999. So very, very early, within its first year. It was the biggest piece of crap you ever saw in your life. I mean, it barely had enough features to even call itself a CRM with a straight face. And even in 1999, it looked like hell. And some things never change, but the deal was, it had one feature, which was the fact that it was in the cloud and nothing else was. And they really understood the power of that feature. And so what was happening during that time was that you had this sort of explosion in software, but the software was all server-based installs. And so what was happening with IT groups was that they were getting, a larger and larger set of server install packages that not only did they have to install and maintain both the hardware and the software, but they had to maintain all the upgrades, and especially all the security upgrades. And so, by the late 90s, you started seeing companies basically call a halt to any new packages. And so it would take, a senior, even in quite large companies, it would take, the very senior most leadership signing off on, a single new piece of software to be installed in the server room. And so what would happen is it became very, very hard in organizations to get software installed. And the real problem were these small to mid-sized businesses that were big enough to have an IT organization and their own server rooms, but were stretched on staff. And so these were the companies that it could take a year or more, to get the company to sign off and get IT to schedule somebody to rack a server and install this piece of software. And so Salesforce's pitch was, you don't have to even let IT know that you're buying it. You can just buy it yourself. It runs in your browser. No one even has to know. And this was the famous no software logo, with the word no software and the big red circle with a slash through it. And, which was, again, brilliant marketing because highly distinctive, but it also directly communicated their core differentiation and their core value proposition. And, but they did not sell to the big companies because at the time, CRM was already a multi-billion-dollar market, and it was completely dominated by one company, Cybele, which was later bought by Adobe. Oh. And they completely dominated the market. But then you had a whole series of other quite large players that dominated. So Salesforce started out as this tiny, tiny ant, among giants. And they did not try to go after the big accounts. That came, more than a decade later. Well, they went after it with these small to mid-sized businesses that had IT organizations that were stretched to the limit. And, and they made that pitch to them that, that you don't need to coordinate with IT to be able to get CRM software. So they would sell it directly to the sales organization. And, and it really worked because it solved a problem that the sales organization had, that there was really no other option. But even in those days, if you looked at those SMBs, most of them bought primarily based on whoever had the largest market share. So even then, it was not a slam dunk. But what it meant was that Salesforce could sell, could sell at a win rate that was consistently above their market share. So if they were 2% market share and they could sell at 2.5%, with a 2.5% win rate, they're gaining market share. Yep. And it took them 12 years to reach a dominant position. So this was not a quick win, but they slowly kept selling, slightly above their market share, taking market share. Eventually, you fast forward 12 years later, and everybody is in the cloud now. It's all SaaS software, and they have no differentiation left. But now they have a dominant market share position, and which they've held ever since. The other thing that this strategy allowed them to do was, if you were the big player, if you were Cybele or you were Act or one of the large suppliers, in order to defend market share, you basically had to offer something for everyone. So you couldn't focus on a particular market segment. So all of your advertising really needed to be spread equally across the entire ICP. And you really couldn't leave any section out, or you would risk losing market share. So you were selling highly undifferentiated products to the broadest possible reach within your ICP. What a company like Salesforce was able to do is basically ignore 90% of the market and focus all their effort on this one particular ICP. And so what that meant was they could pour 100% of their marketing resources into that small market segment and be able to have this idea of an excess share of voice. They could have a louder voice to that particular market share than any of the big competitors, because the competitors had to spread their marketing dollars equally across a much broader ICP. So that gave them this consistently louder voice, along with a significant point of differentiation, at least in the early days. Then they lost that progressively over time. But what that allowed them to do was to consistently, year after year, keep gaining a little bit more market share, and it compounds, like compound interest. Market share compounds over time, and you go 12 years in the future, and now they've got this dominant market share, but they've also have now become essentially an undifferentiated product, and their goal at that point is less about gaining market share and more about defending market share. And so what you saw after 10 or 12 years in, because everybody was in the cloud by then, so it was all SaaS. So they start buying other packages and either co-selling or integrating them together. And the idea was that they needed to have something for every possible customer that might want to buy a CRM. So again, you go to this sort of broad, undifferentiated strategy, but only after you've gained market share.
It's just spread across verticals. They started doing like operational stacks. It wasn't just sales CRMs. It was like operations, and it was like, and you could see them spreading across the organization. It was like the software for the whole org, and then it just became.
Right, right. But the idea was to have the account,
Hmm.
because ultimately, whatever you sold into the account, the idea was they would keep hammering you until they had all of your business. Everything was sort of a wedge product, but the idea was something for everyone. Fast forward to the present, what you see isn't branding that highlights their point of differentiation, because there is no differentiation. What you see is branding that's highly distinctive and highly unique. And so you have Astro and the small child in the raccoon costume, and so you have these highly distinctive characters, and you look at their ads, and their ads are very, very simple. Most of them have 4 or 5 or 6 words in the primary text. What they're doing, because there's no one left that doesn't know who Salesforce is. So what they're doing is they're constantly reminding you that they exist, so that when you need, when you need them, you need a CRM, you're going to always have them at the top of your list. And and this goes back to the thing about the buying committees, is that the buying committees, the other piece of information that I believe came from a Bain study that's interesting is that 85% of buying committees start with a day one consideration set, and that 90% of the final buying choice is from that day one consideration set.
Yep, I
And
saw
so
that
this
study
really,
too.
I think, goes to the heart
Yep.
of the entire ABM strategy, because the whole idea of the ABM strategy is, we're gonna find this intent data as they're researching the product.
On
Well, the
G2 or
fact
something.
is, by the time they're researching the purchase, it's too late. The decision's already been made. And to flip to the other side of the table, what I would consistently see over and over again is a pattern that exactly matches the both the Bain and the Gartner study, which was when they were ready to make a purchase and they put together a committee, they would, before anybody did anything, they typically had about 3 choices. And those 3 choices were either 3 of the top 5 market share leaders, or maybe 2 of the top 5 plus a wild card.
Yep. Yep.
But there was also always, or almost always, a clear favorite. And the deal is they already knew about each of these products before they ever started. So internally, what the process typically looked like is you come together, you sort of already know what you want to buy. There may be some discussion around, is it the number 1 or the number 2 choice in that day one consideration list. Then you put together a procurement document, or procurement request document that you got to send to procurement, because you got to loop them in. And they will then engineer that document so that the only possible product that will meet the requirements is the one that they intended to buy from day one. And then you send that over to procurement, and what procurement will say is, we require a minimum of 6 or 7 bids. And so that's where you start to see the research process. Trust me, it's not the CFO doing this. It is the summer intern doing this. They say, go find us 3 or 4 more things that look like this thing. And it's not because they're going to consider it. It's because they need a few sacrificial
governance,
goats
right?
to toss on the bonfire. Yeah. But at this point, they've already created the procurement document, the requirements document, and the requirements document has already tilted the table in favor of one choice. So you go through this process, and they're never, they'll go through a lot of pro forma stuff. They'll reach out to the company. They'll have the salespeople come in. They sort of have to do this because you got to follow, these rules, and you got to make things look like they're following the rules. But one of the key things in this is that there is this enormous political battle going on between the buying committee and procurement.
Like for me, how there's this discussion around distinctiveness versus differentiation. I think what gets underappreciated is that it's very different when you're a big brand and a small brand. So for me, small brand, yes, you can go after, like you said in the Salesforce example, you can go after a niche audience. Yes, you can use differentiation to your advantage. Is that sustainable in the long term? No, unless you're making really good gains. And then you use that building block to then expand and expand and expand in these sort of layers until you become one of those top 2 on the list. But to get there, I find is a very different strategy and discussion to maybe what some people discuss around this very binary argument, like, no, it's distinctiveness, that's
Yeah,
more reliable, like
it's a
I
dumb
think,
argument.
yes.
It's a very dumb argument because it doesn't reflect the different needs of the company at different stages of its existence. And by
Yep.
different stages of existence, meaning, you know, the fraction of market share you've achieved, how much market penetration you have. But I think that if you're a challenger brand, you've absolutely got to have a real point of differentiation, not to make you different, but to allow you to slice out a well-defined piece of the ICP that you can target so that you can focus all your financial resources on a small subgroup so that you can have an excess share of voice within that subgroup so that you can speak louder than the incumbents within that subgroup. And some fake differentiation, you see a lot of companies that have just bullshit differentiation. It's got to be a real serious differentiation that is baked into the heart of the technology itself. It cannot be something that marketing layers on later, because the problem there is twofold. One is customers aren't entirely stupid. They will figure it out in about 5 seconds, that you're full of crap. And you see a lot of this, we're the number one, whatever. It's like, yeah. And you have 0.1 market share,
No,
market
leading,
penetration.
number one, leading,
Yeah.
whatever,
Number
whatever.
one leading, whatever. Yeah. And those are bullshit differentiation things that were, hacked together by marketing long after the product was done. Again, you go back to Salesforce. They knew what their differentiation was before the first line of code was laid down. It is baked into the very foundation of the product. So you've got to have that level of differentiation at the product development phase. And then marketing needs to understand that and reflect that. But again, the point is that if you don't have a really clear point of differentiation, you don't have any way to segment your target audience, to slice out in a very clear way so that you can target them with advertising and messaging exactly who you want to spend money on to take your message to. If you're not able to do that, if your point of differentiation cannot lead you to clearly see exactly who you need to take the message to, and to be well enough defined that you can actually take it to them, there are mechanisms to really reach just those people and not waste your money on other people. It's a financial optimization strategy more than it's a marketing strategy. It's how do I take, my very small amount of money and put it all on, number 26 on the roulette wheel.
Yeah. Hey, so did you see that paper that Byron Sharp released just recently? It was
Yes.
basically refuting SDP, and I read it, like most of it anyway. It's very long, and I was just like thinking to myself, practically, this is not how it works. And I know for a fact that if I was a small brand, I've had success with this. Like, yeah, sure, maybe there's no empirical evidence, in that sample they were using, or like there's conjecture there. But I'm like, I know for a fact that like this is really effective. And I saw Kuhn Pauls do a bit of a rebuttal on it, like a very well-grounded rebuttal. And I was like, yeah, actually, Kuhn's right here, because this is contextual and different. And this is why, there's differentiation to distinctiveness and SDP or no SDP, positioning, targeting as a ways you should go broad. I'm like, it's so contextual. Like, so like you can take an argument either way, depending on what company you're working for. And I think sometimes, I really like what Sharp and EBI does in terms of like what we know to be true broadly across, all industries and all categories, that there are these general law-like principles exist, but they're not laws. And depending on what size of company maturity you're at, it can be very different, and it can be the wrong thing to do, I think. Anyway.
Well, yeah, and 2 points on that. One is, I think he is absolutely right that that distinctive branding elements are an absolute critical, vital thing.
Yep. Same.
At every stage of the life of a company. The difference is whether or not, and that's independent of being of having differentiation. You can either have this, think of it as a Gardner quadrant. You can either have or not have differentiation, and you can have or not have distinctive branding elements. You've got 4 choices here of combinations. If you going back to Salesforce, because again, I think Salesforce has just hit it out of the park from day one, in ways that are not fully appreciated by most marketers. If you go back to the very earliest days of Salesforce, they had absolutely the most distinctive set of branding elements of any CRM provider in existence. Because, at the time, everybody was trying to emulate Cybele, which was this big corporate, mainframe first software company. And so everybody was trying to do super staid, super corporate, super conservative branding. And and as a result, everybody looked just like everybody else. And you have Salesforce come along, with the no software with the circle with the slash through it. I mean, there was nothing else, you know, in that category that looked remotely like that. So when you saw that, you had no confusion about what you were looking at and who that belonged to. But at the same time, that also perfectly embodied their differentiation. It is the ultimate example of distinctive branding elements that also highlight your differentiation. And so without a single you know line of copy, you have instantly within 300 milliseconds of someone looking at this, they know who it is and what your differentiation is, and that is uniquely brilliant, and you do not see that in SaaS companies today for the most part.
I like the point there is like I also get Byron's point around differentiation. It's a very valid point. Like, and again, we have to make a distinction here between brand versus product layers as well. So I think this distinctive differentiation argument, people don't define what level are we talking on. Like, but I do get that if you're differentiating on a product level, that is increasingly like a short-term thing that will eventually get copied. It's just a matter of time, like, game theory. Someone's going to come and take a
Right.
feature, replicate it, add into their stack, right? So I get that, but like that doesn't mean it's not lucrative short term. And then, like you said, combined with a distinctive brand layer on top, can make that very lucrative space to then sort of push out from that sort of solid base that you've
Well,
owned. And I think that's the play that doesn't get talked about.
yeah, and coupled with very clear
Messaging.
differentiation that is baked into the innovation within the product itself,
Hmm.
that is then accurately reflected by marketing, that has been structured in such a way that you can clearly define the segment of the overall market that you need to go after today, so that you're not spending your money hitting a lot of people who are not going to be influenced by that point of differentiation.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that people I think have to understand is that even within that targeted segment, most of the buying, and again, I think Byron Sharp is correct on this, but I'm not sure he interprets it entirely correctly. He is correct that even if you have a highly differentiated product, if you look at the buying patterns within the narrow targeted, again, going back to the example of Salesforce, in the early days, they were targeting these SMBs with that had IT departments that were stretched. Most of those companies that bought a CRM did not buy Salesforce. They were still buying largely, based on what the relative market penetration was among the options. And so, so even within that target segment, most of the buying patterns are going to look pretty much like what they look like for the overall TAM. But the difference is that if you can gain a couple of points of penetration a year, and you go back and you look at how Salesforce went from 0 to 30% market share. They were gaining about a point or two of market penetration a year, but it was compounding year after year. But they could consistently keep gaining that, and so you're not going to just blow up overnight. Not typically. I mean, again, there are always exceptions, but this is a long term play.
Yeah.
And companies that have pulled this off, they've pulled it off over the span of decades, not years or months.
Yeah, very, very long sales cycles too. And I think, especially in both our niches, like some of these sales cycles can go on for years, right? So, it's really hard to attribute what's working, what isn't working if you're looking at very small time scales. And then it affects your growth rate as well. So, but hey,
Yeah.
I mentioned in one of your very popular posts was around risk-adjusted value and FOFU, I think you call it. There's a new
Yes.
there's a new four-letter acronym that sounds like tofu. Can you explain what risk-adjusted value is? Because it's kind of like conducive to what we're talking about right now.
Imagine you're one of these buying committees and you're looking at 4 different products, and each product has a value proposition and a case for the value they're going to deliver. But you're actually looking at a 5-way decision, not a 4-way decision, because everyone is competing against the status quo. And again, if we go back and we look at the Gartner data, what we see is that in more than half of cases, the status quo wins. But generally, the status quo is going to have the lowest amount of positive value, of sort of declared value. But what people are not seeing is sort of what's below the waterline. And what's below the waterline is negative value associated with risk. Because again, all risk is a dollar value with a minus sign in front. And one of the things that will also happen is that there will be a tendency to undervalue, the potential positive, the potential upside, and to overvalue the potential risk. And again, this is a normal human bias. So you don't necessarily have real value and real risk. You have perceived value.
It's like loss aversion.
Yeah.
People talk about this a lot. I think in Alchemy, Rory Sutherland talks about loss aversion, how influential that can be. So it's not about like, hey, what I can get positively for the business and myself out of this purchase decision. It's about, limiting any downside risk and just going with a sort of satisfactory product that sort of half ticks the boxes at a very base level. And I think, is this what people get wrong? Like very smart people, very technically minded people in bio? Because I know in tech, like sometimes you've got founders who are very technically smart, computer science engineers, but they're very, I would say, dumb when it comes to business smarts.
Well, I've worked on the tech side too, including running a SaaS company. So, so I've been there.
So can smart people be really dumb about understanding this? I mean, because like it's one thing saying it, but how do you take that on board and do something about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge, but again, going back to this kind of idea of risk-adjusted value, because I think this is a core concept, is that the lowest risk option will always be the status quo, even if it's also the lowest value option. And so risk-adjusted value is essentially the perceived value that choice is going to bring minus the perceived, cost of the risk associated with it. And that risk is basically, is this thing going to blow up on me? The problem is that most of the things that will cause a buying decision to blow up, the people making that decision have no control over. You come in, you make that decision, you move on, and then some implementation team that you have no control over, screws it up. And when that happens, no one says, these low level, implementation people messed it up. They say it was a bad buying decision, and even if you're completely gone, they will come and drag you back and attach the blame to you.
What?
It is very career damaging inside a large organization.
Okay.
And I mean, the famous saying that, that goes back probably 40 years almost is, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. And that's where that comes from, is that although the reality is the politics in these companies are generally such that it's got to be a really monstrous blow up to get fired. But what happens is your career for the rest of your tenure in this company is just going to go nowhere. Your next assignment is going to be the junior assistant country manager for Gabon or something.
I've got a good example about this actually, because my brother just I can't say who he is, but he just sort of pushed in a software package into this energy utility, so a state energy utility. It was a kind of a new thing, and obviously, with more transparency of data, But basically, to get this in took years, and he had to convince and tie in everyone else from other departmental functions, like it was, good for them as well. So we had to keep representing the benefits and costs of this to each different sort of department to then get enough collective buy-in to then make the purchase decision, which was a small one at first and then sort of built out from there. But like basically he had to objection handle, what's in it for me, for my department, and why can't we just do what we've always done, which is like manual, reporting and manual data, which of course has its plus and minuses. So I'm just thinking like the way around this is maybe, and this is what I was working with this guy in the Netherlands around, was you map out all the decision makers and you sort of change your sales pitch for each of those decision makers. So you have like your product thing for the line manager that who's buying it, but then you have one for the CFO that's like, talks about whatever, and then one for, the executive or general manager, or one for this, one for that, or the data person, the IT. So like basically you don't have one product pitch, you have like 5 to 7 of them, and you got to hit them all, and then you can coach that person, what we call the champion, who's the person inside that really wants your product, you help them through via this sales enablement process to then convince all those other decision makers with like a really good package and sound watertight pitch. And then you sort of support that person as they sell it internally. And that's kind of a way some companies have got around this using what is called sales, like force management, it's called. It's like this military term.
Right.
And that's the kind of new buzzword on the B2B street, is this force management style.
But let me tell you the flaw in that.
Okay.
You do not, and I promise you, even if you're a salesperson who's deep in the company, and certainly if you're a marketing person, forget it. You're not going to you'll have no clue. But even if you're a salesperson who's deep into the account, you are not going to know what's motivating each of those stakeholders. And you're not going to know whether or not they're actually a real decision maker or they're a proxy for something else. Because one of the things you'll see some, junior, barely above the summer intern level pop in on one of these committees, and they're not really a decision maker. They're a sock puppet for someone else, completely unseen, that they're going to then go back to and, explain things because that person either doesn't want their fingerprints on it, or they don't want, they don't have the time to devote to this, and so someone completely invisible, this not even on the committee, is really controlling that person and making the real decisions behind the scenes. And it's totally invisible. You do not see this. And, so the level of complexity inside these organizations is mind boggling. And the other thing is that, and again, you see this on both the sales and the marketing side, more on the sales side, is that you have these assumptions that there are objections. Well, the objections themselves can be fake, completely fake, because what they're objecting to isn't necessarily that particular feature of that product. What they're objecting to is the fact that someone that they have a political fight with, they want to make sure they don't get a win. And so there is just crazy amounts of very subtle politics that goes on in these organizations that sometimes date back to interrelationships that people have had that go back years, that there's simply no way you're going to know. And so rather than trying to get overly clever, and sort of engineer some magic solution, because you're never going to get it right, go to the basics. And the basics are price and value are not important. That's the first step. And on pricing, this is the other thing, is that there is this battle between procurement and the buying group from day one, because the buying group wants to keep control of the decision making. Procurement wants to take control so that they can give the contract to the absolute cheapest person available. Because procurement gets, their bonuses are based on, we save the company this much money because this is what the high bid was, and this is what we worked them down to on the final bid. And, and so this is the savings, and my bonus will be some fraction of that. And so procurement doesn't care whether or not it works, doesn't care where it's going to blow up, because it's not going to blow up on them. It's going to blow up on someone else. They care about getting the absolute cheapest thing that they can possibly get, and then try to negotiate it even cheaper. And so the people whose job is on the line are horrified at this thought, because what they don't want is some crappy fly-by-night supplier to get the contract. They want to control it. And so again, a lot of this is managed through the procurement requirements documents, where they are setting the requirements in such a way to completely tilt the table toward a single preferred vendor, which is often already chosen before there is any of these ABM intent signals being created.
Okay. So what do we do about this though? Because if people are listening there going, "Oh crap, I'm a small brand or medium brand, like I'm screwed. Like I've been wasting all my time on this," but it probably explains a lot why it's so confusing and hard to forecast sales and why things are getting blocked and you can't figure it out. But
because you have a very, very complicated machine, and you imagine that you've got a very simple machine. And so you're modeling your forecast and your projections based on this sort of fantasy notion.
I call it like gumball marketing, right? Like put some money into the gumball machine, twist the knob, and then a sale comes out. We'll just do more of that.
Right. But again, this goes back to this idea of risk that I think is greatly underappreciated on the sales side. I think it is utterly and totally misunderstood and ignored on the marketing side. And the problem is a lot of the risk perception is baked in by what marketing has done, And it is usually baked in so hard that by the time a salesperson gets in front of a prospect, there is little that that salesperson can do to recover the account. And I'll give you a very specific example. So again, my more recent work has been in with clinical diagnostic companies.
Hmm.
So you see these companies, they're run by, they're founded by scientists, often coming out of academia. They're based on some really fundamental scientific advancement that they're basically turning into some kind of a platform that they're going to sell in the medical establishment. So what happens, they're very product centric and they're very product focused. And, and they're absolutely convinced that this product is so amazing that as soon as word leaks out, people will be shoving POs under red door at night. And then there's usually a side effect here, and you see this with tech companies as well. This sort of idea that the real purpose of this entire exercise is to prove to everyone that I'm the smartest guy in the room. And so a lot of the early marketing tends to be driven by, the need of the founders to prove that they're the smartest guy in the room.
Ego marketing, I call it.
Yeah. And so what you see in this is language like, this is the most revolutionary advancement. There's no product on the market that does anything like this. This is on the cutting edge of science. This is the very leading edge, all of this stuff. And especially with diagnostic platforms, you're selling these, into medical establishments. And I'll come into these companies and I'll see these sales decks that they've been, buffing up for a year, where, the first half of the deck is about, all of their academic achievements and all of their publications, and then the second half is about how this is the most revolutionary thing that's ever been done, that no one has ever seen anything like this. And I look at this and I asked them, I said, do you really think that there is a surgeon who is willing to bet the life of their patient on the most amazing revolutionary thing that no one has ever used before? Probably not. And you presented it like this, you have basically guaranteed that no one's going to buy it, because people are going to look at it and say, that's interesting. I'll wait and see how it works out.
Yeah, it sounds great. Oh, this is amazing. And then they won't buy.
Yeah. Right. But it is amazing. I mean, again, they're not making this up. I mean, some of this stuff, especially, in these biotech companies, are really astonishing pieces of technology. They're just mind blowing. I mean, beyond what a lot of people have any ideas out there. So this really, they're not making it up when they say this is the most revolutionary thing. This is the cutting edge of science. But the problem is that's not what the buyer wants to hear. The buyer wants to hear, I'm going to drop this thing in there and it's just going to work. And no one is, no one's going to die and no one's going to make a bad decision. And that's what they want to hear. And what happens is that if you've been bombarding them with this sort of language in your marketing, by the time a salesperson shows up, it's too late.
Yep.
They've already made decisions about how they think about your stuff. And so again, this goes back to sort of what's below the waterline, that the value of the risk component. So marketing can do a lot to really drive the value of that risk component, to infinity, to where nobody's going to buy anything. So what you have to convince them of, not that the risk is reasonable. You have to convince them that the riskiest thing you could do would be not to bring this on board. I mean, that's how you really solve that problem. And one very specific example was, a package that was designed to do infectious disease testing for transplant patients. It was one of the most astonishing pieces of technology I've ever seen. It was really, truly amazing, because the deal was that in all of the existing testing for infections, the doctor has to make a guess as to what the virus is, because you have to order individual tests for different viruses.
Yeah, it's like discounting, kind of, it's like a period of elimination kind of thing until you get to the one that it is.
Yeah. So you got to make a few guesses, pull a blood sample, go run the test. If they all come back negative, now you're going to make a few more guesses.
Yep.
And you keep going through this, and and time is short. So with this test, you take one blood sample. You basically sequence everything in the sample. You subtract, you pipe the data over to bioinformatics package up in the cloud. You subtract everything that's human, and then everything that's left is not human. And then you start taking every one of those sequences and you compare them against a reference database of every known organism. And one by one, you can identify everything that's in that sample that's not human. And, so a single test, a single run, and you can see everything there, even if it's something that no one has ever seen before. And this really works. I mean, this works really quite well. So
it's like Theranos, but like proper. 2.0.
Well, Theranos was completely different.
Yeah.
Uh, but but the deal was that you couldn't go in and sell this as a replacement for the existing tests
Mhm.
because they work. Even if there's these problems of having to guess what the which test to order,
Yep.
they're very stable. They've been around 20 years. Everybody trusts them. So you can't go in and say, get rid of all your PCR machines because now you've got this thing because nobody, it's too risky. But what you can say is keep all that stuff, keep doing what you're doing, and what this is the hat that you can pull a rabbit out of when no one's expecting you to pull a rabbit out of a hat. That when everything else fails, when you've gone through all of the existing tests, you turn to this thing, and it will give you the answer every time. This is the platform that will, that will give you that answer when no one's expecting you to give them an answer, and that becomes a very powerful thing. And so then you've taken it from being this sort of extremely high risk choice to the riskiest choice I could make would be to not bring this on board and not have this capability. And again, you've got to step out of the shoes of a marketer and step into the shoes of a buyer. So, but this becomes a heuristic for estimating market penetration from the standpoint of the buyer. They don't have to do a bunch of complicated research. It's just a gut based on, well, I hear from about them all the time. And so, the problem there though is that if you look at companies of all different sizes in B2B, the average amount of revenue that is devoted to marketing is typically between 6 and 9% of top line revenue for profitable companies. Now, again, it'll be higher for VC backed companies, that are throwing, zero interest rate dollars at them, which don't exist anymore. But, so for most profitable companies, they're going to spend between 6 and 9% of their revenue, top line revenue, on marketing. So if you're a $1 billion company or a $10 billion company, 6% of 10 billion is a lot more than 6% of 5 million. And so this is where the share of voice comes in, is that if everybody is spending roughly the same share of top line revenue on marketing, that $10 billion company is going to have a lot bigger megaphone than that $5 million company. And the way you fix that problem is to differentiate the product, pick a well-focused niche that you can identify, pour all of that money you've got, which isn't very much, if you're that small brand, into that tiny niche, knowing that the big company has to spread their dollars equally across the entire TAM. And so, and so the idea is that people within that niche, now they hear more about you than they do about the big guy, and they don't know who the big guy is, because no one goes and, no buyers go and do market share research analysis. Just, it's not a thing. What they do is it's a heuristic just based on how much do I hear from this company versus that company. Well, I hear from them all the time, so they must be a safer choice. So again, this goes back to the early Salesforce strategy, that and it goes back to the stuff that people like Les Binet and Peter Fields talk about, which is this idea of share of voice, that you need to have the loudest megaphone for the audience that you're targeting, which means you can't target everybody. You've got to pick somebody. You've got to pick somebody that is going to listen to you because you've got something special for them. That's the differentiation component. And you've got to be able to effectively pour all of your money into, instead of spreading it, on every number on the roulette wheel, you're going to put it all on number 26 and spin it. So again, one of the points of confusion, and I've written about this recently, is that in the last 20 years or so, with the rise of digital and the rise of MarTech, all of the numbers that people are working with are coming out of the MarTech packages. Zero of those numbers have anything to do with effectiveness. They all 100% have to do with efficiency. And again, you look at it's simply what the metrics are called. Anything that starts with a cost, anything that has the word per in it, cost per lead, anything that has the word rate in it, click through rate, anything that has the word return in it, return on investment, return on ad spend. These are all efficiency metrics, and the problem is that if you're not thinking about and measuring effectiveness, you have no idea whether or not you're being effective. And if you're only following efficiency metrics, they can lead you astray. And and part of the deal is that if you're doing stuff that fundamentally doesn't work, or only halfway works, but you found a way to do it at half the cost, that is not a win. And and you see this in something as basic as ROI. And the example I give is that you know the highest possible ROI campaign that the marketing department of a restaurant can do is to have someone stand next to the hostess stand, and everyone that comes in with a reservation, you give them a 50% off coupon. So your cost per lead is effectively zero. Your conversion rate is effectively 100%. You now have the highest possible ROI marketing campaign possible, and it's obviously absurd. Which means that you cannot rely on these metrics to guide your decision making around whether or not what you're doing is effective. When I talk about effectiveness, I always go back to a very, very, very basic definition of what is marketing. Because if we don't know what marketing isn't just doing a lot of random shit. Marketing has a very specific purpose for existing, and that purpose for existing is to change the future state of the world to something different than what would have otherwise occurred if you had not done the marketing. And that change in the future state of the world is going to be manifest in the form of increased buying propensity in the minds of future buyers. And the way that you achieve that is by implanting memory traces, in the minds of future buyers that will allow them to, remember who you are, recall who you are based on buying triggers, certain buying triggers that will influence them to, be slightly more likely to buy your stuff than to buy the other guy's stuff. And that is the purpose of marketing. So the problem is that if you want to measure effectiveness, you're not going to measure that in your Hubstack package. You're going to measure that by looking inside the brains of future buyers. So as a result, if you're not, looking to the outside world and measuring changes that you're creating in the external world, you are not measuring effectiveness. And there are multiple ways that you can measure this. One is you ask them, and again, you can't ask them with a survey because that doesn't work, but you can ask them through well-designed, structured longitudinal customer panels. This is a classic technique that's been around for generations in B2C. No one does it in B2B, but well-designed longitudinal customer panels allow you to see, the changes you're making and how those changes are progressing over time in the minds of future buyers. The other thing is you can look at behavioral traces, things like volume of brand aware search or share of brand aware search within your category, that will give you behavioral proxies for what's inside people's minds. But marketing is about changing memories. Memories are what make money, and you have to be able to identify and measure the presence of the changes in those memories in order to know whether or not you're being effective. And this is hard to do. It's very doable, but you're not going to get it from some report that comes out of HubSpot.
So what did you bring on the show? What are you drinking?
Basil Hayden.
Ooh, yum.
Which is a single barrel, 9-year aged Kentucky bourbon.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so we got, if it's Kentucky bourbon, then we've got at least 51% corn mash with maybe some other grains, and also charred Newark barrels, correct? I think that's the stipulations for it to be Kentucky bourbon versus Tennessee whiskey, for example.
Right.
I'm not sure if it says it, but that's the appellation in Kentucky.
Specially crafted new toast charred oak barrels, and I think they use Burgundy barrels that Burgundy wine had been aged in, and then they char the barrels, and then age this 9 years in those barrels.
Oh, yum. Oh, that's amazing. I'll tell you a story. So I went to Hotel Monteleone in New Orleans, which is a very historic hotel there with this carousel bar, right? It's kind of like the attraction, one of the attractions in the
Right.
whole
Yeah.
town, because Truman Capote wrote a lot of books there, and so did Ernest Hemingway. But Truman was very famous for like drinking a lot at this bar, and ridiculously priced. But you're on this bar. It's like
Right.
slowly going around in a circle, which I think back in the day was a very huge thing, but now we're just like, oh, whatever. But very ornate, very historic place to stay, very plush. I think just like quintessential Southern luxury. Went to some really cool bars and everything, but I had this one, Thomas Handy, which is the original Sazerac, is made with Thomas Handy brand. No, sorry, yes, Thomas Handy and Sazerac. Well, there's one called Sazerac actually, but I tried Thomas Handy, tried Squilling Pig. What's that? Rip Van Winkle. That's right. That's one of the most expensive whiskeys there is. And I had like, I think a 21-year-old Rip Van Winkle was incredibly expensive. And it was good, but I probably
I
wouldn't
can
pay
imagine.
$31 a nip or $55 a nip or something crazy. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
buying some of those more niche ones like you have, it's probably the way to go because you get better ingredient quality than some of the bigger brands. We've talked a lot about what we kind of should be doing and some of the misconceptions that are out there that hopefully people listening maybe have a better idea about how it actually works underneath. And I've been thinking to myself, like, and I think How Brands Grow and some other books like that are very good at sort of giving some infallible sort of pillars with which to rely on when we're approaching any brand and any sort of challenge in any sector. But if I had to ask you, like, what are the first principles of marketing, effective marketing? What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, again, I think it goes back to why does marketing exist?
Hmm.
Yeah, and if you cannot answer that question, then you don't have any sort of guidance for what you should be doing, other than just whatever is the random grab bag of stuff that that whatever Martech vendor we bought last year is telling us to do. So the flavor of the month is now ABM. So, and you're doing a lot of crazy stuff like spending huge amounts of money on intent data where there's no intent inside the data, but it's just the random thing that everyone's doing this year. So that's what we're doing. And, and I think what's missing is a real fundamental grounding in, why marketing exists. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Marketing exists to alter the future state of the world to something different than what would have existed if we had not done the marketing. And that future state of the world is embodied in the minds of future buyers in terms of their ability to remember you, to have those memories triggered by key buying situations, and for them to understand why they need to choose you over the other guy. Because at the end of the day, it's all about getting people to choose us over the other guy. The key thing is that everything you're doing is about implanting highly structured memories into the minds of future buyers. And if you don't understand that, then you end up doing a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily make any sense. And I'll give you one specific example. One of the things that I see in literally 99% of all video ads on LinkedIn, and these things are not cheap. If you've ever done a LinkedIn ad campaign, it is not an inexpensive platform.
Mm-hmm.
So about 2/3 of the people on LinkedIn have autoplay turned off on videos because otherwise you're just bombarded with crap. The point of that ad is to implant a memory. If 75% of the people have autoplay turned off, what do they see? What they see in 99% of cases is either a completely blank white screen or a completely blank black screen because that's frame zero in the video. And they don't see your logo, what you can sell. They don't see they don't make frame zero the equivalent of a display ad or a reason to click the play button so that you can get the message. If you do play it, or you do have autoplay on, what you will often see is a 60-second piece of video where none of the branding elements appear on screen until roughly the last 2 to 3 seconds of the video. So you're roughly 90% of the way through the video. And so what are you doing? What are you implanting on people's minds if it is not branding elements that they need to remember that defines who you are. And so it doesn't matter how good the creative is. If you have not connected it to the brand and you've not connected it to recall triggers, it may be entertaining, but it's going to be worthless as a piece of marketing. And again, this is an example of, if we do not know why marketing exists, we're going to do stuff that makes no sense because we don't have any guideposts for where we're going with this. We're just doing a lot of random shit. And a lot of marketing is doing a lot of random shit. And because you're not doing any sort of effectiveness measurement, all you're doing is efficiency measurement, then you become obsessed with things like ROI, which isn't even a real metric. I've written about this in a post as well, where, marketers obsess over ROI. ROI is not a real number. You cannot calculate ROI under 99.9% of cases. That, if you're running long-term marketing mix modeling studies or econometric modeling studies, which no one knows how to do, only then are you going to be able to actually calculate ROI. Because the problem is that your marketing has a long tail to it. So a large portion of the impact of this period's marketing is going to be in the future. A large portion of the buying decisions this period were influenced by marketing in the past. And so you can't simply take this month's marketing costs, and divide it by this month's revenue to come up with an ROI. It's a fake random number, because you've got all of the stuff from the past and all this stuff, and a large portion of current marketing that doesn't have any impact till the future. And so, and this is a classic example of,
which is also, even like, there's an X factor to that, is that the length of the buying cycle. So if you've got a purchase decision that's like very lengthy versus, toilet paper, which you buy once a month, like, you've got to extend that view out even further. Like, so that's another compound on top of that.
Well, but it depends on whether or not you're in the day one consideration set. Because if you're not, the impact is zero. But the point is that nobody thinks very deeply about this. And so they just sort of randomly divide and multiply numbers together that have no correlation with each other, that are having effects over completely different periods of time. Plus the other thing is that you look at really good media modeling. Larger B2B, B2C companies do this. What you will see is that there is some often significant fraction of revenue that cannot be accounted for by anything marketing does. Basically, if marketing went away tomorrow, you'd still have revenue coming in. And that revenue would still be about roughly 100% of what it has been, and it will slowly start to decline over the subsequent 2 years, which means that, what marketing is impacting is not revenue, it's incremental revenue. And if you can't measure the incremental revenue that marketing has impacted, you don't have the R in ROI. And if you don't know which pieces of marketing from the past and the present influence that incremental revenue, you don't have the I.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I mean, ROI is terrible because it also provides an incentive to reduce the I as well, because it's the easiest way, like, cut the I than to raise the R. So therefore, there's this perverse kind of like, well, to slash the budget, that'll increase the ROI. I'm like, yeah, but it's not going to give you effectiveness.
Plus you can do stupid things that will maximize your ROI and kill the business, like like the 50% off coupon to everyone that walks in the restaurant who has a reservation already.
Not great for margins. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because I was criticizing this lamb ad, which, again, it's a 3-minute TV spot, supposed to sell lamb. There's been category decline over the last 2 decades. Like, right. Literally, consumption per capita still high in world standards, but just been going like this, sort of like bottoming out now, not increasing whatsoever. Yet this campaign's been winning effectiveness awards, even long-term effectiveness awards for years. Same thing happened with Got Milk. Category decline, going down. And my argument is that, like, if it's not increasing sales, like, you can't really call it effective. Like, maybe it's effective to some advertising or creative person, like, because it was creative. And I'm like, there's a difference between creativity and commercial creativity. So, like, then the counter argument to me criticizing that was, well, maybe the rate of decline wouldn't have been so much without the ad. I'm like, okay, you kind of have a bit of a point, but I'm sure when you read the award submission, it was like, we increased sales by X over X period, which ended up being a very short period where they could hack
Right. Yeah.
the Y axis so it looked good, but then it declines after that. So I'm like, can you really call marketing effective if it doesn't lead to increased sales?
Yes. Well, but I think there's a distinction between, first of all, between creative effectiveness and marketing effectiveness. So you can have an ad that is, excellent in terms of creative effectiveness, but if you're selling into a declining market, you're not going to be able to turn it around. You see this with the milk ad. You saw this with remarkably creative ads from Apple for iPods during the period when people were switching away from iPods and just doing the music on their phones. And and it didn't matter how creative that was, that market's going away, and you're writing it down to the bottom. So again, I don't think you can use revenue to determine whether or not the ad is effective and whether or not the creative effectiveness was good or bad. And again, I think the other thing about marketing is going back to the definition of marketing, which is you're changing the future state of the world in a way that benefits the business. So, what would have been the future state of the world if you had not done the marketing? And let's look at the Apple iPod example. If they had not done the marketing, then the future state of the world would likely have been an even more rapid decline in the iPods. But because they did the marketing and they continue to do product innovation right up to the end, the late generation iPods were very, very, technically innovative. It's just that they could not compete with the iPhone, which had all of the functionality, that you had in the iPod.
Yep.
But did the iPod market last an extra 5 years longer than it would have? Probably it did. So again, it isn't the absolute outcome. It is what's the relative outcome compared to what would have been if you had not been there. If you had not been there as a marketer. And so I think that's where marketing effectiveness comes in is, did you change the future state of the world, in a way that is positive to the business?
Hmm.
And that might mean that the product lived an extra 5 years before it died.
Or just a stabilization in the loss of growth, like a 0% growth rate could be a win. It's all relative to what, but
Right,
to make that sound argument, you would need to know the baseline of decline without you, and by playing in the market, you are changing the game. So it's really hard to have like a pure baseline there of, well, what would have happened
but
if
it's
we
not
didn't
hard.
exist. Yeah.
It is, but it's not hard. And companies do this every day. And what they do is they use marketing mix modeling or econometric modeling, where you're looking at the relative uh, impact on incremental revenue by each individual channel that you're marketing through, as well as the conjoint effects between the channels. So, for instance, if you're doing billboards, then you're going to see in the area where you're doing billboards, you're going to see an increase in organic search.
Yep.
And so these channels, influence one another. And so this is what the marketing mix modeling does: is it allows you to see, and again, you have to structure the studies in the right way so that you have areas that are excluded from certain campaigns or from certain channels at certain periods of time, so that you can see the relative difference of these effects. But what these processes allow you to do is to see exactly what the world would look like if you did not do marketing.
Yep. Exactly.
And this is why things like MMM modeling and econometric modeling is the gold standard for marketing effectiveness.
Yeah, because to set them up
again, not all companies can do it.
Yeah, and to set them up properly, you do need to create those baselines. You do need to input your seasonality. You do need to input a lot of that stuff.
You need to have either sector or geographic exclusion periods, and so you have to structure it to be able to get it to work, and you need a lot of data. And so again, companies like P&G are absolute experts at this because they've got an enormous amount of data and a lot of markets. If you're a small startup, you're simply not going to have enough data to do it.
Hmm.
So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to fall back on what are known principles of marketing effectiveness. So essentially do things that other people have proven to work, rather than just doing whatever random crap, the latest Martech vendor suggested,
Yeah, yeah,
or
exactly.
or something you read on Gartner.
Or a Forrester report or something. No, I think that's really interesting.
Right, right.
Yeah, look, I think, again, the counter argument sometimes people say, just to finish, is that, oh, well, we got the word out there, we increased awareness, like, our reach figure was up, wherever they pulled the reach figure, right? So therefore, marketing job done. I'm like, well, maybe not. Like, there's a difference between, like, people knowing who you are and then, like you said, affecting purchase decisions in the future. And if it's not, there's a big difference between knowing who you are and then forgetting about you and not affecting the purchase decision. Like, it
Well,
really
but
depends how that branding process and the specifics of the execution and how you schedule that communication over the buying cycle time. Like, that's really critical. And like, it's not always just job done if it's a popular campaign that people know about.
yeah, but the other thing is you have to look at the inverse of this, and the inverse of this are NFTs. So the non
Mhm.
fungible tokens, Bored Ape, that that the market for that went up like a hockey stick.
Mhm.
Was that because all of the crypto bros suddenly became marketing Einsteins? Probably not. It didn't have anything to do with marketing. It had to do with a fad, that sucked a lot of money in, because people thought they were going to get rich off of this fad, and so that entire run up in in the revenue curve for NFTs had nothing to do with marketing doing a good job. And then when it peaked and it collapsed, that also had nothing to do with marketing doing a bad job. It was that all of that revenue change up and down was completely irrelevant of what marketing was doing. It was, these were secular trends in the larger society, and they were riding them up and then they were riding them back down again.
Mhm.
And so you know again, you go back to the NFT example. If no one had done any marketing, what would those curves have looked like? Chances are they would look pretty similar to what they already look like. A giant hockey stick up and then a collapse off the cliff, um, because there were external sort of macro economic factors that were driving this, and societal trends that were driving this. So, a world with no marketing for NFTs probably looks about like the world with marketing for NFTs, because the marketing wasn't effective, because that
Mhm.
wasn't what was driving it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So again, it's everything is about the counterfactual of what the world would have looked like if you hadn't been there versus what it ended up looking like because you were there.
That's a good point. So you sound like a well-read individual. You said you had an academic career, so I'm sure you've read lots of books. Is there any books or things that you've read recently that's really changed your mind for the better you'd recommend listeners who read?
A definite recent read is Karen Nelson Field's book on attention in marketing. That I think is worth reading. In terms of a classic, probably the all time most influential book on me, for me personally, is a book called Reasoning About Knowledge, which has nothing to do with marketing. It has to do with
Epistemology.
thinking. So, well, it's interesting. There are three authors. The two primary authors, one is a philosophy professor and one is a computer science professor,
Ooh.
and it's about what are we capable of knowing, given you know given an available collection of information from the outside world. What can we really know about the world with that given collection of information? And the answer is generally a lot more. If you're very clever with how you analyze the information, you can learn a great deal more about the world than you think you can. And then they had a very good follow-up book called Reasoning About Uncertainty, which is sort of the inverse of this. Is the limitations that because the outside world is not orderly. Um, it's a very, very chaotic, very probabilistic environment, and that sort of baseline level of uncertainty puts a real limit on what you can really do and know. And again, I think that book has a lot of has a lot of lessons for marketers, in the sense that you have these sort of very idealized models, like, you know, the marketing funnel that just doesn't exist. Or uh, or your lead scoring system, which is just bullshit. Or your lead nurturing campaign, which is also bullshit. There's these you know these kind of performative things that marketers do because they believe certain things about the world, and the reality is the world is a lot more uncertain and a lot more chaotic than can be accounted for by these sort of naive, simple-minded models. And if you don't understand that and you don't see that level of chaos, the level of chaos doesn't mean you can do nothing. It means that you have to understand the limitations of what you can actually accomplish. And again, you see this going back to our very early discussion about interacting with buying committees and trying to guess exactly what the right thing to say to each person is. The problem is the real process is so chaotic and so full of hidden factors that you do not have access to, that any sort of a scheme like that you put together is just going to be absurd. It's going
or not
it's going to be
scalable.
completely disconnected from the reality of what happens.
Hmm.
And so the deal is if you understand that, you don't waste your effort on stuff that you can't guess. You spend your time on things that you can control. And I think this is a big miss in a lot of marketing, is that, going back, for instance, to the fact that, you cannot guess who's, what the, what the motivators are for each person on the buying committee, because you may not even know who's making the real decision. It could be somebody hidden off stage. But what you do know is that everybody's going to be concerned about uncertainty and going to be concerned about risk. And so, you can start to have a very general conversation about why this is the low risk option, why this is the safest choice that you can possibly make, and now you're going to be able to move the table and, move the final decision. And so, if you do not have a clear sense of how the world works, you're going to be doing a lot of stupid stuff that just doesn't have any impact.
Yep.
And you're going to not have the resources to do the few things that will have an impact.
To play on that, like, this happened when I was consulting a client, small challenger brand, trying to go up against the big guys. They had a sort of partial contact at a very large enterprise organization. So we created this campaign where we got a senior executive from that very large organization on board to be like their pilot customer, right? Because we knew, and we did everything at all costs to get them on board, like, basically didn't make any money or a loss on that. But what we could do is, once their logo was a user and that person, we had then in that testimonial, like, yeah, we use this brand, then it just opened up all the doors to every other similar large customer, because when they saw the thing and they saw the quote from that company, instant trust transfer, bang. Oh, well, if XYZ company uses this, then we should at least consider them,
right?
like,
yeah.
And then we kind of faked it until we made it. Very effective though, and yet that's the way to sort of jump up. So, like, coming back to you, that's what I was thinking. I'm like, you got a risky product, we need to de-risk this. What's the best way to do it? Testimonial from a
Right, and that's a trust signal.
Yeah, exactly. And then everything else is trust. So then we started.
And in every single industry, there's going to be one or two companies that are going to be the real leaders, and everyone else is going to be a follower.
Yep.
So for instance, in oil and gas, it's Exxon. If no matter what oil company you've got, if you say, well, that's what they did at Exxon, then that's all you need to know. And you see this in the auto industry. You see this in lots and lots of different industries where, there's a company that everyone knows is a really tough company about these sort of decisions. And if you've gotten into that company, that instantly becomes a significant trust signal. And again, what you're doing is, with these trust signals, is you're reducing the perceived risk associated with choosing you.
Yep.
And
that's how fundraising works. It all goes VCs.
Back to risk, but it all goes back to risk adjusted value. That if you cannot reduce that perceived risk, and you cannot rack up enough of these trust signals, you're going to have a very, very hard time, no matter how much you think your value is that you're delivering.
Over to you. Can you give us a pitch? What do you do if people are listening that are inside your ICP?
So one of the things I'm in the middle of working on right now and should have ready to launch by early March is a cohort-based course on marketing attribution. Um, that's going to bring in a lot of this stuff about efficiency and effectiveness and how you measure, both of these. And so that should be available by early March. And then there's going to be a follow-on cohort-based course on marketing effectiveness specifically.
Great.
That will probably come April or May. But if anybody's interested in either one of those courses, just look me up on LinkedIn. I'm just Dale W. Harrison, and send me a DM, and I'll add your name to the list, and I'll let you know when it comes out.
And
So it's probably going to be about a 6-week course, one session a week for about 6 weeks, with a cohort.
do you do anything else on the side? Or?
Yeah, so I do consulting work, and I'm, most of it is around biotech, simply because I've got the scientific background, and and so I can come in and I understand the science, and I understand the marketing, which gives you an edge in that environment. But I'm also doing increasing work outside that. So I just picked up a client today that's a SaaS company. I'm probably gonna pick up another client by the end of the week that is another SaaS company that's actually in the analytics space. So so I do work well outside just biotech, but usually with things that are fairly companies that are doing fairly technical things.
You did mention, you kind of answered this question already, but the best way to contact you is maybe to reach out on LinkedIn. So Dale space W.
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably
Harrison.
the best place.
Yeah.
So just Dale W. Harrison on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only one there with that name, and I post regularly there.
And
So I've got a lot of material there that I post, and I do a weekly LinkedIn Live there as well. That's specifically focused on tactical marketing and sales issues focused on biotech companies. A lot of that stuff on the LinkedIn Lives is designed to be very, very tactical, hands-on. How do you really solve these problems in a real company with real examples?
yeah, well, hey, Dale, I really appreciate your time. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while and get you on the recording. So a big fan of your work. So keep it going. And yeah, I'll reach out once
Well,
your
thanks.
courses are live because I'm interested in that. I sort of did a bit of a mini series last season on here around attribution and marketing measurement, MMM
Yeah, I saw
versus.
that. I listened to all of them. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. And I think it's a really interesting thing, but I'm also conscious of some of the political realities that affect different companies as well, which is another complexity layer on top of that. So it's always interesting when that gets involved. But yeah, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. And let's talk again because I think this was good.
Yeah, this has been great. I appreciate it. Thanks.